Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Hello. Churchill once famously said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others that have been tried." Did he oversell its merits, though? The Russians have never been entirely convinced of its virtues, as Martin Sixsmith reveals in an epic new Radio 4 history of the country. And David Runciman is here to suggest that even democracy's most devoted fans may be blind to some of its weaknesses. Also with us this morning is Elif Batuman, whose book The Possessed unexpectedly put literary theory onto the New York Times bestseller list. Stay with us if you want to hear about the unexpected connection between Isaac Babel and King Kong. And Anne Dudley, whose latest opera, about a doctor who also happens to be a dog, set her the challenge of writing a trio for the canine voice. She's very kindly standing in today for her librettist Terry Jones, who's not able to join us because of a temporary case of distemper. We start, though, with democracy, an ideal that has, in the last few weeks, brought ordinary people onto the streets in the Middle East and put British jets into Libyan airspace. In these unsettled times, should we be optimistic about democracy's prospects, though, or worry about its limitations? The political theorist David Runciman is going to be exploring both sides in a lecture he's giving later this week, titled "Can Democracy Cope?" David Runciman, I want a bit of a cliffhanger here. Save the answers to the question until a little later. But first of all, why should we worry? We're used to the idea that democracy is a universal panacea for prosperity, for freedom. Yeah. Where do the anxieties arise?
Well, we're living in a world where part of us believes that democracy is a success story for good reasons, because it's had a very successful 100 years. And the Arab Spring is the latest stage in this story. There's lots of grounds for optimism. And then there's this underlying anxiety in the established democracies that something isn't quite right because they're struggling with these big challenges: climate change, debt, war. We're not successful at war at the moment. A lot of democracies are heavily in debt. Some of them have gone bust. And there's this sense that we're being pulled in two different directions. It's the long-term answer to our problems, and yet it's bad at long-term thinking. And there's a puzzle there that I'm interested in.
This paradox has a history, doesn't it? I mean, it's not a recent thing. It's been consistent with democracy throughout, from the very beginning.
It has. For a long time, people thought democracy didn't work because it was a kind of mob rule. Then in the 19th century, people started to worry about it the other way. And Tocqueville, the great writer about American democracy in the 19th century, was probably the first person to spot this. He went to America and he thought, this isn't mob rule, this really works. This is a dynamic, vibrant form of politics. The danger is it works too well. The Americans are going to become complacent, he thought. They're going to become, the word he used was fatalistic. They'll drift along with their fate rather than taking decisive action to change it. And he thought, therefore, democracies needed crises occasionally to wake them up. But he also thought that was dangerous, because the thing about a crisis is it's very unpredictable.
And then Nietzsche takes an entirely different view. I mean, very, very often confused, you argue.
Yeah, and for example, Francis Fukuyama in The End of History runs together Tocqueville and Nietzsche as these people who worry about democracy. But Nietzsche's the other way. Nietzsche's someone who does think democracy is a kind of sham, it's a con. It makes the world pretty and nice when the world is nasty underneath. Tocqueville was the other way round. Tocqueville thought that democracy wasn't a con. It really worked. It made sense. But its dynamism was going to drift away over time, because if you live in a successful polity, democratic, you get comfortable with it and you think it'll be all right in the end. Whatever crisis is coming around the corner. So democracy kind of becomes a game of chicken. You think, yeah, we know we have to deal with this, but we know we can deal with it, so we'll wait. And it may be we're living in that world now.
And then we've also got Thomas Paine, and he's got a subtly different anxiety about it again. Now, what's his anxiety?
Yeah, so in my lecture I say there are sort of three views of how democracy can go wrong. It's Nietzsche, it's basically a sham. Tocqueville is too good for its own good, if you like. It works too well. And then Thomas Paine is someone who thinks there's a threshold you have to cross. There's a point at which democracy works, and there's a point where it doesn't. And a lot of contemporary political science is obsessed with this, looking at the Middle East, looking at North Africa. What's the cut-off point? If you can get over that threshold, it'll be all right. If you can't get over that threshold, democracy will fall away. And you can become obsessed with the threshold. And I think we live in a world where people think it's an either-or thing. It works or it doesn't work. Whereas I think Tocqueville was closer to the truth. It works, and that actually makes us blind to some of its weaknesses. And it makes us obsessed with trying to make other democracies like us.
OK, well, if Tocqueville was right, then you have to take with you his argument that we need crises to keep us honest.
You do, and I think
that's a counsel of despair, isn't it? Because it doesn't it say that despots will always be with us.
No, I don't think it necessarily says that, but I think it's a very dangerous argument, and Tocqueville was aware of this himself. What's the right kind of crisis to wake up a democracy? Because you don't want it to blow too hot. You get a real crisis and you might collapse into autocracy. You don't want it to blow too cold. If it's a nice crisis where democracy shows its strengths, and the recent credit crisis and the economic crisis is a good example of this, where people want to get it just right. Was it serious enough that we've actually addressed the underlying weaknesses of debt? But if it was too serious, we might go bust. And I think democracies hover in this dangerous middle ground. And there is something really quite creepy about saying a democracy needs a crisis, because it's brutal and cruel. And I don't think anyone should say that, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
And what about the current financial crisis? We heard Nick Clegg this morning saying, well, we're going to be rewarded in the end, we've taken the right steps. He seems to think this is the right crisis and that democracy will come out of it stronger.
And there will always be democratic opponents who take both positions. There are some people who think America's going bust, Britain has taken the necessary steps, and democracies have to be absolutely ruthless about using these crises to retrench. There are other people who say, well, look, we're democracies, we're going to be fine. This is panic-mongering. That's the Labour Party position, the position of some people in the United States.
Now, what about the currently very interesting situation of the Middle East and the debates people have about whether democracy is a good fit for certain kinds of society? You talk in your lecture about the necessary conditions for democracy to exist. One of those I thought was interesting because it's catch-22. You said, but you need a certain level of prosperity. But then, since we're told that democracy is the necessary condition for prosperity, we're in a bind here, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And there's a lot of quite solid, hard data that suggests there's a cut-off point of per capita GDP around $6,000 or $7,000. If you can get above that, democracies are secure. And if you're below that, they're in trouble. The temptation for the politicians, with any view of history that says there's a winner here, democracy is the long-term winner, is to try and jump the gun, to try and accelerate the process. That can be very dangerous, and there's a lot of evidence that Western politicians have got this badly wrong.
Martin Sixsmith, this relates very closely to
Well, it does, and I think
history.
David's lecture is very timely, because I think in the West we've come to assume not only that democracy is the least bad form of government, but that it's the only form of government. And I think we have this sort of Bruce Willis approach to history, that the despots are bad, so we have a revolution, and afterwards everything will be fine. It will be democracy. They'll be like us. And I think it's relevant to point out that there are a lot of places where democracy is not the best fit, Russia being one of them.
And
well, you talk in your talk. You talk about the demographic having to be right, and you talk about if it's too skewed towards too many young people in a population, democracy might not be the right thing. But surely a lot of these North African countries and Middle Eastern countries where we've seen this Arab Spring have precisely that population of a very large number of young people.
They do, and that's one of the reasons for some people to be quite pessimistic about it. But it brings people out onto the streets, it creates a volatile politics, it creates crisis circumstances. There's quite a lot of evidence that when the median age in a country is quite low, the volatility lasts and democracy is very vulnerable. And the thing about the established democracies of the West is that they have a very different age profile, and it's bridging that gap. And there is some evidence if you can get a democracy up and running, people, apart from anything, change their reproductive behaviour and demography shifts. But the problem is getting the process started. It's exactly the same catch-22 as the economic threshold. You know where it is, but knowing how to cross it is very, very hard.
You don't have any suggestions then, I'm taking it from that.
Well, how
do you get exactly as in Egypt, how do you get a young revolution and turn it into a stable democracy?
It takes time, it takes patience, and it also takes a certain amount of realism. That's the thing. The thing, like Martin says, that can be dangerous. We know, in a way, our democracies are incredibly secure now. It's very hard to imagine circumstances in which our democracies would fall apart. And that actually gives us a kind of blind spot about thinking about other parts of the world. We can't really see it from the other side of the threshold. But trying to see it from the other side of the threshold would make us, I think, more sensitive to these problems.
Elif, Batuman, it relates a little bit to your book here. I was very struck by reading particularly about Dostoevsky and his views on democracy. Not a fan at all, Dostoevsky.
No, he wasn't. While this has been going on, I've been living in Turkey since the fall, and I've just been thinking about Ataturk and how he brought democracy, but he brought democracy through autocracy. I mean, he autocratically brought in democracy. And then what did people do? You know, by the time there was a generation that could take advantage of the democracy, they voted in Islamist conservatives who are taking away people's civil liberties. But they are the democratically elected party. And the military, who's upholding Atatürk's, you know, civil liberties and the Western-style government that he brought in, a lot of people still, my parents, the intellectuals, I'm working at a university now, a lot of people still believe that it's up to the military to ensure that democracy keeps on going. So you're stuck in this paradox.
It's very striking, too, isn't it? A functioning democracy with a cult of personality. A very odd combination.
It is an odd combination, but it's a familiar one. Martin is going to tell us.
It's not
tell us all about it.
In Turkey, I think the democracy we in the West want to impose is the democracy that elects the right people, isn't
Yeah,
it? So
exactly.
in Afghanistan and Iraq, they might elect
it's not
the
a
wrong
content.
people.
Democracy isn't a content.
No.
It's only as good as what you choose with it.
Precisely.
That is one of the things that can persuade people to go back to the kind of Nietzsche view and think it's all a sham. There's always that temptation to, particularly in crisis circumstances when a strong leader emerges, but people think, we're seeing the real side of democracy now. Actually, it's just the rule of the strong man.
Well, it's odd, isn't it? Because it means that democracy, one of the tests of democracy is a government that fails on a regular basis and is ejected. We're going to turn to Martin Sixsmith now, because it's the perfect moment to go to your grand history of Russia. You're doing this hugely ambitious 50-part radio history of Russia on Radio 4. You begin it with a correspondence mea culpa. You reporting from Moscow at the time of the 1991 coup. You confess to having been euphoric about the possibilities for change and reform and modernisation. It didn't then unwind as you predicted. What had you forgotten about Russia's history?
Well, as I say in the book, I'd forgotten the lesson of history. But my only excuse, I can say, is that everybody else felt the same, because if in August 1991, when communism was on the verge of collapsing after all those years in power, and it had been done, it had been brought about by the heroic efforts of the Russian people. And, if you'd spent that week with them, which I did, you do get swept up in this sort of great moment of catharsis that, we've actually done something, we've changed history, and now everything will be different. But the mea culpa, as you say, is, of course, if I'd sort of sat back and thought about history, it's not the first time that in the 1,000 years of Russian history, autocracy seemed to be on the point of being thrown off. And what I've tried to do in this, in the book and in the radio series, is to go back and look at the previous points where people were probably very euphoric. They thought that, now we're going to have proper freedom, democracy, liberal Western-style government, and in the past it's never worked out.
That's putting it mildly. I mean, reading your book was like watching one of those Saturday morning thrillers where the heroine is constantly nearly escaping but then falling back into the clutches of the villain. I mean, it happens again and again and again. Just take us through some of those incidents, because very early on in Kiev, you have examples of a kind of what looks like a proto-democracy beginning to work. The Vesh.
Quite astounding. Precisely, yes. In Kievan Rus, it wasn't called Russia in those days, they were the Russian lands. There was devolved government, and the city-states were nominally under the big boss man, the Grand Prince in Kiev, but they actually ran on their own fiefdoms on a very sort of participatory basis, and the people, not just the landed gentry, not just the clergy, but everybody would gather, as you say, at these viechas, where they were able to give their views on political developments. They were able to elect the local mayor. They were even able to elect and throw out, in certain places like Novgorod and Pskov, they could throw out the Grand Prince. So, that is sort of embryonic democracy. But of course, that all comes grinding to a halt in the 13th century when the Mongols invade and a very different model of the state is imposed. The state then becomes a very centralised, autocratic, militarised machine where individual rights and the fate of individuals is subjugated very much to the needs of the state. And it's that collectivist model which worked in Russia, because Russia was a very vulnerable country. Its borders were long and open, very hard to defend. And if you have this sort of rather nice participatory government, there's no centralised authority to defend the country. So the Mongol system caught on, and it worked very well for the Russians.
You characterise that as a kind of fatal moment in Russian history, because it leaves the country permanently poised between the East and the West, and permanently uncertain about whether it's a European country or an Asian country.
Indeed, and that's a dichotomy which permeates Russian thought down the ages. This, are we Europeans? The answer is yes, to a certain extent we are, because we have European culture, we have European values, we are looking westward. Or are we Asians? And of course the geography of Russia is that the larger part of Russia is in Asia. So that's one thing. But it's this mentality of, for the want of a better phrase, Asiatic despotism, which has permeated Russian political thought. And actually, we in the West, we have this sort of immediate recoil that, despotism, bad thing, autocracy, bad thing, democracy, good thing. But if you look at whether it works or not, the lesson is that autocracy, centralised autocracy, has worked in Russia. And it's, one of these things that you have a very big disparate state, and you can't really govern it by...
One would have to ask what you mean by work. Because in some respects, you don't look at Russia and say that is a kind of leading light for modernisation, for...
No, but on the other hand, the country has held together this great deep-seated fear in the Russian psyche that we are weak, we are vulnerable, and, we have this history of being invaded from the West and from the East. And at least if we have a strong centralised government, so they call it the silnaya ruka, the strong hand, or the iron fist, we'd call it, at least that allows us to stand up to these dangerous influences on our borders. In Western terms, maybe it hasn't worked because actually individual civil rights and liberties and freedoms do take a back seat in that model. But as the great conservative of the 19th century, Konstantin Pobyedonossev, argued, you can't run a country where there are 100 different nationalities, 150 different languages, by a Western-style parliamentary democracy, because if you try it, the whole thing just tears apart at the seams.
You also suggest in your book that there is a kind of popular acceptance of that argument. I mean, there's a very interesting moment where Herson is arguing about Russia and explaining this paradox that you have a revolution there. And he says, well, it's because we've already know what collective life is like. We've had serfdom. We're ready for a kind of communist autocracy and primed for it.
Yes, I think that's right. Not just communist autocracy, but autocracy in general. And when you look at the revolutions in the Middle East, they clearly are, popular discontent spilling over into violent action against an autocracy which is imposed on the people. And I've seen commentators saying, well, the next domino to fall will be Russia, but it won't, because in Russia autocracy is popular. If Putin or Medvedev, or Putin and Medvedev, were to stand for election, they would be elected with a massive majority, and it's because people know that it works. They saw democracy in the 1990s. They saw the Yeltsin sort of liberal market freedoms, and the whole country just fell apart. So in 2000 along comes Putin, autocracy is back. But since then, the country is again stable, it's again prosperous, and it can punch its weight on the world stage. And that is, makes autocracy very popular.
Presumably, there's not much distinction between an elective autocracy and a democracy. I mean,
well, yes. I mean, I should be more nuanced, of course, because in the last 11 years there have been elections. So nominally there's elections, but the Putinites call it euphemistically managed democracy.
Just quickly, because I want to open it out, but I wanted you to answer one question. Your book is, it's a long, big book. The first 1,000 years of Russian history get the first quarter of the book. The remaining 100 years of Russian history. Why is that?
Because there are a lot more sources available.
Right.
We can go to
it's
talk to people.
It's not that it tells us something about Russian history itself, in that it did go into a period of kind of cryonic suspension.
Well, it did precisely after the Mongols. Look at the literature and art. Before the Mongols, we had this great flowering of literature, and then after the Mongols, everything just gets suspended, and then the culture starts to re-emerge really in the 17th century. So there's that long gap where we have no artefacts, we have no sources to figure out what was going on.
David Runciman.
Martin's book's very interesting, in part because it's also a history of Western illusions about Russia. You gave your own example of it. And in a way, the template for the classic Western deception about democracy is 1917, the February Revolution, the Democratic Revolution, which was greeted with euphoria in the West because we'd been fighting this war, the First World War, alongside the Tsar, so it couldn't have been a war for democracy. Then the Russians democratise. We think, great, the war is going to be a war for democracy and we're going to win it, without noticing that for the Russians, being a democracy meant they could get out of the war. They wanted to stop fighting the war. That was the popular movement. And that fatal miscalculation by the West had catastrophic consequences. A lot of the tragedies of the 20th century come out of that. It's the classic hubris of thinking they're a democracy like us.
Yeah, precisely. If you look at that period between February and October 1917, Lenin himself said there is no country in the world which is as free as Russia. And he was right, because in those few months, the government did try to run a Western-style liberal democracy. Sadly, in the middle of a world war with people out on the streets, it's not the best time to experiment with democracy. And it all reverted in October.
Elif, Batuman, you say interesting things about the relationship between autocracy and Russian creativity. I mean, there's this interesting paradox that Stalin takes time out to sign Isaac Babel's execution order himself personally. An appalling thing, but also evidence that he takes literature seriously. And Russian writers feel this too, to a certain degree.
Yeah, definitely. There's poems where Mayakovsky says that he dreams that Stalin will be addressing the Politburo about the production of verse compared to the production of pig iron. And in a way, all that repression made it was kind of true. It was a dream, but it was also true. And in a way, all of this repression from above did create a flowering of literature. I'm kind of, if I can go back to, I was curious about, to what extent, when you say that there's this Eurasian mass versus the small European, to what extent are Eurasian and European metaphors, and to what extent are they real? Because it seems like the GDP is the more defined. When Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were down on democracy, what they were dealing with was a small literate overclass speaking French versus these masses of liberated serfs, and it wasn't really that they weren't Mongols, they weren't really Asiatic, and that was just kind of a metaphor to say that there was a big uneducated mass that couldn't be relied on.
Precisely, it is absolutely a metaphor. And you look at the Slavophiles and the Europeanizers in the 19th century, and it is very much that. It's how do we think of ourselves? Alexander Bloch writes, "Are we Scythians? Are we these sort of Asiatic Mongols, or are we Europeans?" And he can't reach a conclusion in the poem, and it's that sort of the self-image of Russians. They don't really know, and they're pulled in both directions, and it's a very difficult position to be in, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But you studied in Samarkand for a time, so you spent a lot of time in as it were, one of the colonized republics.
Yeah.
What was the attitude there to a sense of Russianness?
Oh, it was. I was there in 2002, and it was not a very pro-Russian time. I don't imagine it's gotten more pro-Russian since. Well, there were some people who missed the Soviets because matches were very cheap, and then they were very expensive when I was there. But a lot of people were saying things like, "If only we'd been colonized by the British, like India, then we would be like India now instead of like Uzbekistan." That was the general attitude.
I'm going to turn to you and your book now, staying with Russia but changing the subject slightly. Your book, The Possessed: Adventures with Russian Books and the People Who Read Them, is essentially about the study of Russian literature. It had fantastic reviews in the US. My favourite one said this: "If Susan Sontag had coupled with Buster Keaton, their gifted love child might have written this book." Fantastic mental picture there, Susan Sontag and Buster Keaton.
My mother actually wasn't thrilled about that, I don't think.
No, probably not. I thought the writer got one thing absolutely wrong, though. She's completely at odds with Susan Sontag, because Susan Sontag famously said, "Interpretation is the revenge of the intellect against art." Your book, it seems to me, says exactly the opposite. Interpretation is an act of love towards art, and that's why you engage in it.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I do feel that very strongly, and I sometimes I'm very flattered when people compare me to Susan Sontag, but there's a lot that I feel differently about.
So tell us how the book came about. I mean, you describe your passage into Russian literature as almost a sort of chapter of accidents. I mean, certainly in some later respects of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a book about making mistakes. The part about Uzbekistan is a great example. I kind of ended up there because of my own misconceptions about East and West, where I thought my family's Turkish. I was born in the United States, and through a series of kind of chances and mischances, I ended up studying Russian literature. And then at a certain point, I found myself in Turkey, actually talking to a lot of military people, because my aunt at that time was working in the Turkish Secret Service, and I had a job working as a...
She put a tail on you,
yeah,
didn't she?
she put a tail on me. I was working for a tourist guide. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and they have a series of travel guides that are researched by students. So I was wandering around central Anatolia looking at hostels and stuff like that, and pretty much every obscure bus station I would get out at, there would be a representative of the local municipal government or the army. I was supposed to be looking at shoestring cafes, and instead I saw all these military resorts and anyway, so I was having dinner with a colonel from the Turkish army, and he was asking me about my studies at Harvard, which he was very interested in. And when I told him I was studying Russian, that just made absolutely no sense to him. He was like, "Why are you not studying Turkish literature?" And I had this idea of Uzbekistan in my mind as somewhere that, because the Uzbek language is a Turkic language, and but it's written with a Cyrillic script, and it's where Turkish borrowed French words when it modernized. The Uzbek language borrowed Russian words, and I felt like it was some place that would have some synthesis of Turkey and Russia, which was not an idea that I examined very closely, or I would have seen that it was complete nonsense.
It was also to do with getting grants. You're very funny.
The book is a lot about getting grants. Yeah, it's based on my years as a graduate student, and a lot of that is trying to get as much money as you can.
It's extremely good on the comedy of academic life, the unintentional comedy. You have this long chapter, Babel in California, which is both Isaac Babel, but also, I think, this collision of completely incompatible languages from all of these Isaac Babel scholars who come together. And you write that almost as a novel. Had you written a novel before you set out to write
Yes,
this book?
my plan originally was to write a novel, and I basically ran out of money, and I went to graduate school to chase the funding, as you pointed out. I became involved in this conference about the work of this enigmatic Russian Jewish 20th century writer, Isaac Babel, at Stanford University. And Stanford was I'm from the East Coast, so California was already this completely bizarre place to me, where everyone somehow ends up. There's this line in the picture of Dorian Gray that Basil has disappeared. I suppose we'll find out that he's in San Francisco because that's what happens to everyone, and it must be he possess all the marvels of the afterlife. It's like that. Everyone turns up there. All of these Russians, and anyway, so there was this incredible conference that took place where Babel's last living relatives were there. There were some Chinese filmmakers. A cinematographer who had shot the first Chinese cowboy movie, the first Chinese Western. He was there to readapt Babel's Red Cavalry, which is a very horse-centered series of interconnected short stories. He was going to adapt it to northern China. And, so there was just a lot of tension between the kind of the old school Russians and the Chinese and the graduate students like me who were driving around picking these people up from the airport. And I really wanted to find a way to write all these things in a form that would capture all of the different languages.
Well, you write about the academic life as a kind of pathology, isn't it? It involves paranoia, it involves
monomania,
infatuation, monomania, obsession, fetishism even. You
Absolutely.
go to the Tolstoy conference it's Isaac Babel, and somebody has written out a list of all of the objects he owned, including his rubber bathtub.
Well, that was the KGB who did it. That was their fetishism. That document was
Yes, but a scholar has now got this and thinks it's meaningful.
Yeah, but it was one of a lot of the records of Babel just came out from the KGB archives in the 90s, and that was a list of all the things that had been confiscated from his dacha. That included his rubber duck, the things were described in a lot of detail. His old sandals.
Tell us, because people will be furious, having promised to say what the link between Babel and King Kong was. An extraordinary bit of 20th century intellectual history. This.
Isaac Babel, his horse-centered short stories were written while he was a propaganda officer in the Red Cavalry during the Civil War in 1920. At that point, there was a unit of American pilots who had been fighter pilots in World War I, and they were now flying on behalf of the Poles. And one of the planes was shot down behind enemy lines, and Isaac Babel was the interrogator because he spoke all these foreign languages. He was the interrogator of the fallen American pilot, who's described in his diary as this barefoot, with the aura of coffee and the West and Conan Doyle. And it later turned out that this shot down American pilot was Marion Cooper, who later came up with the story of King Kong.
But you weave it even further. You've got scholars then who say, no, this is really significant because there's a connection between.
King Kong he's the Cossack, he's the primitive monster. So there's this scene in the movie where King Kong is on the top of the Empire State Building shooting down the American planes. Marion Cooper was actually he was one of the actors who was in the plane being shot down, and he was an actual pilot who was fighting against the Cossacks in this war. Yeah, I loved
that you were working on an exhibition about Babel at the time, and you were sent off into the archives to find a suitable propaganda poster of a Bolshevik as a gorilla.
So I showed him a still of that, of King Kong on the tower, and he was like, "That's Commander Trunov." There's a story, Commander Trunov, where involving someone on the ground shooting planes.
Yeah,
David Runciman.
I really enjoyed the book. One of the things it reminded me of was Tom Stoppard in his Coast of Utopia plays about Russian emigres in the 19th century. At the beginning, he says he was drawn to the subject because they were nostalgic. It relates to what Martin was talking about. They were nostalgic for censorship because Russia was a society where words really matter. And then they would move to Paris or London. Everybody was writing. Everybody was talking. And the words disappeared into this babble. And academic life is a bit like that. There's this kind of nostalgia, and you capture it. It's a very funny book, but the sadness, which I can relate to, of academic life, just awash with all these words. And people are drawn back to these writers obsessively, in a way, fetishistically.
Where it meant so much.
It meant so much.
I liked your reference to the rubber duck of Isaac Babel, because it's funny in a sense, but it's slightly poignant in another sense, and that really sort of captures that era. And his widow, Pirashkova, when she writes in her memoirs about the day he was arrested.
There.
Yes, she's dead now, but I knew her when she was very old. And when he's taken to the Lubyanka, she's allowed to go with him to the door. And as he's taken away and she's left there, she says, well, who's going to make him his cup of tea in the morning, because he can't start the day without a cup of tea? And it's just that sort of little detail which gives the poignancy of the whole situation, because of course he disappeared into the great maw of the Soviet gulag and was dead, shot as being a spy, ridiculously.
Yes, I was interested about a particular incident where Tolstoy meets the critic, and you say, and Tolstoy says to the critic, your judgment is true about my work, but it doesn't say everything I want to say about it. If I wanted to express all I meant about Anna Karenina, I've already said it. That's the book. And I think it's sort of ironic that maybe artists aren't the best people to talk about their work sometime, and it seems that this is the way that the world works now. I mean, it reminded me of Philip Pullman, who laments the amount of time that he has to spend talking about his work, and indeed he gets paid more sometimes to talk about his work than indeed to do it.
Yeah, someone promoting a book right now that resonates very strongly. You write a book,
and you were just saying of all the places that you've been to promote your book,
nobody becomes a writer because of their great love of the spontaneity of the spoken word, and then you write a book and you're on the radio all the time.
Yeah. And your book is in part it's a meditation on what a novel is for. I mean, that's one of the things that runs all the way through it. You say at one point, one likes to think that literature has the power to render comprehensible different kinds of unhappiness. If it can't do that, what is it good for? What did you... one of the things I liked about the book is that it doesn't become disenchanted. You don't really become disenchanted by academic life, because you hold true to what's good about it.
Thank you for saying that. That's my...
But you don't become disenchanted with literature either. So what was your kind of end conclusion about the novel? What does it do for us?
Well, when I wrote that, I was about conveying different kinds of unhappiness. I was talking about kind of an exit from identity politics, where, a lot of different groups have laid claim to, and this is something that I kind of blame on the culture of the creative writing programs in the U.S., that they... that students are taught to mine their personal past for their historical or personal or racial or economic grievances, and then tell those stories. But that actually unhappiness is a much more flexible thing. It's not like because I'm Jewish or because I'm Hispanic or because I'm poor. We're all miserable.
You got ticked off, didn't you, for not being sufficiently empathetic, or you didn't have the ability to be sufficiently empathetic to the problems of
Isaac Babel because I'm not Jewish. I get that occasionally from I get reader mail that's about that, which I think is really missing the point of what literature can do, which is to make every atomized experience something that we can all understand.
Okay, well, we're going to turn now to what music, what opera can do, what art can do in the Opera House with you and Dudley. People have sometimes unkindly compared contemporary opera to cats being neutered. Your new opera, The Doctor's Tale, which opened the other night at the Royal Opera House, literally, and I mean literally, contains a trio for 3 dogs that are waiting to be put down. So how did you come to be writing for the canine voice? How did that come about?
Well, it was a complete surprise, really. I have no ambitions really to write an opera. It was not something that I'd a burning desire to do all my life, and I was approached by the Royal Opera House, the ROH2, which is the experimental arm, and they said, write anything you like, just make sure it's quite short, because it's for a season called Opera Shots and we want to do some quite short operas. And I approached Terry Jones to write the libretto, and I thought I might get something political, something sort of satirical and Monty Python-ish, and I hadn't anticipated getting dogs and doctors, especially not a doctor who is a dog. But it turned out to be quite a rich theme for comic invention and operatic passion indeed, because we have love at first sight, we have sudden death, we have life after death, and all these.
It begins with very, very moving set of songs about how wonderful this dog is. Before you actually fully know that he's a dog, you're told about his wonderful virtues, his empathy, his tenderness, how he prescribes exchanges of affection 27 times a day. And it's only after that you find out that he's a dog.
Yes, it's a very mild take on prejudice, I suppose. In another era, our doctor might have been Jewish, he might have been black, 150 years ago he might have been a woman. And the other very mild undertone is actually, it's about love. It ends up to being a great sort of love fest, and all our 8 characters neatly.
You say this almost apologetically, that it has this content in it. Why is that?
Well, it's not the normal subject of a modern opera, I suppose. Is love.
Well, of course, you're brought in partly to do that. I mean, one presumes it's called opera shots because it's like a shot of whiskey. It's short and punchy, but it's also a shot in the arm, isn't it? It's supposed to be a shot in the arm for contemporary opera.
I think it is, because none of us who have written any of these in this series have really done a lot of opera before. And it's not going to be a terribly long evening in the theatre, and if you really hate it, you're going to be out in an hour, so you can still go out and have dinner. But hopefully it brings in people who might not have felt inclined to come to the opera house before.
I have to say, it feels a very short evening, which is a good thing in itself, and it's a very enjoyable evening too. Both of these operas work in very different ways. What about the one of the reviews? You got a nice review which described your solos as being gorgeous, I saw, but the critic went on to say she should write a musical.
Yes, and you're going to say to me, where is the boundary between an opera and a musical? And indeed, it's a very blurred boundary. I mean, it used to be with the classical musicals that the main sort of body of the plot would get taken along with the spoken word, and then the characters would break into song. This is the sort of classic mid-20th century opera, South Pacific and Oklahoma, and earlier than that, Cole Porter and Jerome Kern. But there's always that slightly eggy moment where they feel a song coming on. And the sort of intro of the song starts underneath the dialogue, and hey-ho, here we go. And it is actually easier in a way to have yourself a whole world of opera where you sing everything. You have to sing all the plot and all the songs which reflect on the emotion of the time. And then the thing is, once we got past the 70s, there's plenty of musicals which are sung through as well.
Well, exactly. So it's been blurred from both sides,
yes,
isn't it?
Pretty blurred.
And did you find, I mean, clearly the Opera House invited you to do it. Were there any residual sort of uncertainties that you detected with a kind of fine canine ear, a faint sort of standoffishness at all about these experiments, or is it you think it's open to it now?
No, I think not at all, actually. They've been incredibly open to whatever we wanted to do. And the singers themselves, when I've spent a long time notating these dog howls, I can tell you.
Tell us a little bit about that, because it's a lovely moment. They're all in the pound.
They're all in the pound.
There's a headmaster who is an excellent headmaster, but he slobbers over his pupils. So
Yes.
he's in a cage. There's the
Yes.
doctor who has been hauled up by the General Medical Council for being a dog, and then there's a waitress who unfortunately keeps making love to the customers' legs.
Yes,
so
indeed.
She's in there, and they're all waiting to be put down and sing this.
Very Gogolian.
It is very Gregorian in all sorts of ways. Yeah.
Yes, I suppose it is really. They start howling, and this idea that one dog starts howling and it sets all the others off. Clearly, that's if ever you've been in a company.
Tell us a little bit specifically about composing that, because you get as it were, what could be a straightforward comic song from Terry Jones, who wrote the libretto. You've done something very different with it.
Well, I think it's very sad, and I think it forces us at the end to question, well, what right have we got to put down dogs? Terry told me of an incident where, in fact, the vet came along and put down a dog who was living next door and took him away in a big plastic bag. And Terry never quite got over it. And I think my song turns into a sort of spiritual, really. So these people are lamenting their situation, and they're all sort of empathising with each other.
And the howls lent themselves to that.
Well, the singers were fantastic with the howls, and were prepared to try all sorts of different pitches of howls until we got exactly the right ones.
Martin Sixsmith, you were there.
I enjoyed it fantastically, and it is Gogolian, but it also puts me in mind of a story by a Soviet author called Mikhail Bulgakov called The Heart of a Dog, and he also has a dog who becomes a human, but his is much more sort of aggressive and bitter, because it's a satire on the new Soviet man and how the new Soviet man can't work. But your dog was lovely. I thought he was, this sort of idea that we can solve the problems by just being nice to each other. And it was much more sort of subtle, I thought. I enjoyed that very much. And the singing of the dogs was absolutely fantastic. Tom referred to it, and just singing, ow, ow, and it was so musical.
Thank you very much. In fact, that story that you refers to has recently been set to an opera, A Dog's Heart, which was a stunning production at the ENO.
David Runciman.
I enjoyed the scenes where the General Medical Council are trying to decide whether to strike off this dog, never mind put him down. And I've always thought there's something odd about the way we treat the GMC with this reverential way. When politicians pass judgment on other politicians, we think it's absurd and farcical. But somehow we think this is a very august body. And I love the way you brought out all of these bodies as slightly absurd. I don't know, this is what Terry was trying to do. But it captured something about the pomposity and the absurdity of that as well.
Yes, I think there's a lot. There's a scene where rules are rules, and we can't throw the rule book out, because without rules our society will indeed go on the blink, which brings us back to Martin's point, I suppose.
It was very moving, the end. I like the fact that the General Medical Council basically goes down to love. I mean, he falls in love with one of the protesters, doesn't he? And
indeed,
I don't think I'm giving anything away. Elif, just quickly, why is this... we've been talking about Gogol and Bulgakov. Why is it that Russian literature is so attuned to this kind of surreal comedy?
It's interesting, yeah. I have a friend who was on the Russian literature job market, and one of the questions she got asked was, how many works of Russian literature can you mention that involve a sentient dog? And it's I don't know, I've been thinking about the dream in Anna Karenina, where there's this peasant who can suddenly speak French, which is the peasants would normally speak only Russian, and only the upper classes would speak French. So I think there's just some idea of that you're surrounded by these things, by this huge. I mean, the Asiatic mass, or the former serfs or whatever. You're beings who are sentient but who are not fully human, but are passive. It's
certainly more attuned to the surreal. Anyway, thank you to all of our guests. Elif Batuman's The Possessed, Adventures with Russian Books and the People Who Read Them is out now. David Runciman is giving his lecture Can Democracy Cope on Wednesday in London. Details are on the Start the Week website. Martin's Sixsmith series on Russia, The Wild East, will start next Monday on Radio 4. And Anne Dudley's opera, The Doctor's Tale, is on now at the Royal Opera House. Next week, Andy Marr is back here to talk morality, genius and genes with Sam Harris, Lucy Winkett, Masha Gessen and Adam Rutherford. But for now, goodbye.
Worked, it made sense, but its dynamism was going to drift away over time, because if you live in a successful polity, democratic, you get comfortable with it and you think it'll be all right in the end, whatever crisis is coming around the corner. So democracy kind of becomes a game of chicken. You think, yeah, we know we have to deal with this, but we know we can deal with it, so we'll wait. And it may be we're living in that world now.
And then we've also got Thomas Paine, and he's got a subtly different anxiety about it again. Now, what's his anxiety?
Yeah, so in my lecture I say there are sort of three views of how democracy can go wrong. It's Nietzsche, it's basically a sham. Tocqueville, it's too good for its own good, if you like. It works too well. And then Thomas Paine is someone who thinks there's a threshold you have to cross. There's a point at which democracy works, and there's a point where it doesn't. And a lot of contemporary political science is obsessed with this, looking at the Middle East, looking at North Africa. What's the cut-off point? If you can get over that threshold, it'll be all right. If you can't get over that threshold, democracy will fall away. And you can become obsessed with the threshold. And I think we live in a world where people think it's an either-or thing. It works or it doesn't work. Whereas I think Tocqueville was closer to the truth. It works, and that actually makes us blind
into Libyan airspace. In these unsettled times, should we be optimistic about democracy's prospects, though, or worry about its limitations? The political theorist David Runciman is going to be exploring both sides in a lecture he's giving later this week, titled Can Democracy Cope? David Runciman, I want a bit of a cliffhanger here. Save the answers to the question until a little later. But first of all, why should we worry? We're used to the idea that democracy is a universal panacea for prosperity, for freedom. Yeah. Where do the anxieties arise?
Well, we're living in a world where part of us believes that democracy is a success story for good reasons, because it's had a very successful 100 years. And the Arab Spring is the latest stage in this story. There's lots of grounds for optimism. And then there's this underlying anxiety in the established democracies that something isn't quite right, because they're struggling with these big challenges: climate change, debt, war. We're not successful at war at the moment. A lot of democracies are heavily in debt. Some of them have gone bust. And there's this sense that we're being pulled in two different directions. It's the long-term answer to our problems, and yet it's bad at long-term thinking. and that's some of its weaknesses. And it makes us obsessed with trying to make other democracies like us.
OK, well, if Tocqueville was right, then you have to take with you his argument that we need crises to keep us honest.
You do, and I think
that's a counsel of despair, isn't it? Because it doesn't say that despots will always be with us.
No, I don't think it necessarily says that, but I think it's a very dangerous argument, and Tocqueville was aware of this himself. What's the right kind of crisis to wake up a democracy? Because you don't want it to blow too hot. You get a real crisis and you might collapse into autocracy. You don't want it to blow too cold. If it's a nice crisis where democracy shows its strengths, and the recent credit crisis and the economic crisis is a good example of this, where people want to get it just right. Was it serious enough that we've actually addressed the underlying weaknesses of debt? But if it was too serious, we might go bust. And I think democracies hover in this dangerous middle ground. And there is something really quite creepy about saying a democracy needs a crisis, because it's brutal and cruel. And I don't think anyone should say that, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
And what about the current financial crisis? We heard Nick Clegg this morning saying, well, we're going to be rewarded in the end, we've taken the right steps.
There's a puzzle there that I'm interested in.
This paradox has a history, doesn't it? I mean, it's not a recent thing. It's been consistent with democracy throughout, from the very beginning.
It has. For a long time, people thought democracy didn't work because it was a kind of mob rule. Then in the 19th century, people started to worry about it the other way, and Tocqueville, the great writer about American democracy in the 19th century, was probably the first person to spot this. He went to America and he thought, this isn't mob rule, this really works. This is a dynamic, vibrant form of politics. The danger is it works too well. The Americans are going to become complacent, he thought. They're going to become, the word he used was fatalistic. They'll drift along with their fate rather than taking decisive action to change it. And he thought, therefore, democracies needed crises occasionally to wake them up. But he also thought that was dangerous, because the thing about a crisis is it's very unpredictable.
And then Nietzsche takes an entirely different view. I mean, very, very often confused, you argue.
Yeah, and for example, Francis Fukuyama in The End of History runs together Tocqueville and Nietzsche as these people who worry about democracy. But Nietzsche's the other way. Nietzsche's someone who does think democracy is a kind of sham, it's a con. It makes the world pretty and nice when the world is nasty underneath. Tocqueville was the other way round. Tocqueville thought that democracy wasn't a con. It really...
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Hello. Churchill once famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others that have been tried. Did he oversell its merits, though? The Russians have never been entirely convinced of its virtues, as Martin Sixsmith reveals in an epic new Radio 4 history of the country. And David Runciman is here to suggest that even democracy's most devoted fans may be blind to some of its weaknesses. Also with us this morning is Elif Batuman, whose book The Possessed unexpectedly put literary theory onto the New York Times bestseller list. Stay with us if you want to hear about the unexpected connection between Isaac Babel and King Kong. And Anne Dudley, whose latest opera, about a doctor who also happens to be a dog, set her the challenge of writing a trio for the canine voice. She's very kindly standing in today for her librettist Terry Jones, who's not able to join us because of a temporary case of distemper. We start, though, with democracy, an ideal that has, in the last few weeks, brought ordinary people onto the streets in the Middle East and put British jet